The most photographed face in human history is a lie, and until 18 months ago, nobody on Earth had the equipment to prove it. Not archaeologists with a century of training, not conservators who have spent their careers inches from the object, not the museum that has protected it under armed guard since 1922. The lie was built by master craftsmen more than 3,000 years ago, and it was built so well that gold itself kept the secret. Then, a team of physicists aimed a machine at the object that reads, not what metal looks like, but what metal remembers, and the memory it pulled out of the gold did not match the name carved into it. If you want to understand exactly what that machine found, why 100 years of expert examination missed it completely, and what it now means for the most famous burial in the ancient world, stay with me. Because the golden mask of Tutankhamun just stopped being what everyone assumed it was. Start with the discovery itself, because the mask was never meant to be famous. In November of 1922, in a narrow valley on the west bank of the Nile, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter broke through a sealed doorway that had not been opened in over 3,000 years. Behind it sat a burial so complete it defied belief. Gilded shrines stacked one inside another, chariots dismantled and packed into a space too small for them. Furniture, weapons, jewelry, more than 5,000 individual objects crammed into 4 cramped rooms carved out of limestone. At the center of it all, inside a stone sarcophagus, inside 3 nested coffins, lay the mummified body of a teenage king, and resting directly over his face, sealed against his skin for 3 millennia, was 11 kilograms of solid gold shaped into the likeness of a young pharaoh's features, inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, and turquoise glass. That object became the death mask of Tutankhamun, and within a decade of its discovery, it had become something larger than an artifact. It became the visual shorthand for an entire civilization. The story attached to the mask was simple, and for most of the 20th century, nobody had a reason to question it. Tutankhamun died young, somewhere around the age of 19, likely from a combination of malaria and a badly infected leg fracture. Egyptian religious law required burial within 70 days of death. His court, caught completely unprepared for the death of a king still in his teens, had just over 2 months to build a tomb, gather funerary equipment, and prepare a body for eternity. They succeeded, the story goes, through extraordinary effort under brutal time pressure, and the golden mask was the crowning achievement of that rushed but successful undertaking. It is a clean story. It is also, on close inspection, full of holes that researchers have quietly noticed for decades without ever being able to prove what they meant. The first hole is the tomb itself. Compared to other royal burials in the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun's tomb is small, almost embarrassingly so. Other pharaohs were given sprawling, multi-chambered complexes cut deep into the cliffs, decorated with painted corridors stretching for dozens of meters. Tutankhamun's tomb has 4 small rooms, and several of its wall paintings show visible signs of haste, thin paint, uneven lines, sections left incomplete. The enormous stone sarcophagus bears chips along its corners, consistent with workers forcing it through a doorway that was cut too narrow to receive it. None of this proves anything on its own. Rushed work happens. But it establishes a pattern, and patterns matter when you start looking at the smaller objects buried alongside the king. Several items recovered from the tomb do not appear to have been made for Tutankhamun at all. Some of the jewelry is sized and styled for a woman. Some of the small gilded shrines and coffins carry cartouches, the oval hieroglyphic name rings used to identify royalty that show clear evidence of having been altered, with an earlier name scraped away and a new one carved over the smooth surface. Egyptologists have long accepted that at least some of the funerary goods placed with the boy king were originally intended for someone else entirely, repurposed under the pressure of that 70-day deadline. The obvious question, the one that has hung over the discovery for a century, is whether the single most important object in the entire burial, the mask itself, was one of those repurposed items. The detail that kept this question alive longer than any other is the ears. If you examine the golden mask closely, the earlobes are pierced with 2 small holes drilled cleanly through each one, exactly the kind of holes designed to hold hanging earrings. In the visual language of New Kingdom Egypt, this detail carries real weight. Adult male pharaohs were essentially never depicted wearing earrings in formal royal art. Pierced ears in official portraiture were associated with children and with women. A craftsman commissioned to build a sacred, eternal likeness of an adult male king would not have added pierced ears by choice. It would have violated the symbolic rules that governed how a pharaoh's spirit was meant to be represented for all of eternity. And yet, there they are, 2 small, deliberate holes in the most sacred object recovered from the tomb. Layered on top of that is something more subtle, something that shows up only when you study the proportions of the face itself. Multiple researchers over the decades have noted that the features on the mask read as unusually delicate, fine-boned in a way that departs slightly from other confirmed portraits of Tutankhamun found elsewhere in the tomb. Alongside that, close inspection of the gold has occasionally noted a faint difference in tone between the face and the surrounding headdress, a subtle shift that some attributed to different smelting sources or different working techniques. None of it was dramatic. None of it, taken individually, could support a firm conclusion. But together, the pierced ears, the delicate features, the tonal variation, and the pattern of repurposed objects elsewhere in the tomb, a theory began circulating in academic circles, discussed at conferences and in specialist journals rather than in headlines. The theory proposed that the mask had not been made for Tutankhamun at all. It had been made for someone else, modified under emergency conditions, and placed on the boy king's face because there was no time to make a new one. There's a further detail that rarely makes it into popular retellings of the discovery, but that specialists have pointed to for years. The interior of the mask, the hollow underside that would have rested directly against the mummified head, was never fully polished the way the exterior was. Rough tool marks remain visible on the inside surface. Inconsistent finishing that suggests the craftsmen working under time pressure focused their effort entirely on what would be seen, not what would be sealed away forever inside 3 nested coffins. That kind of shortcut makes sense for an object being urgently adapted under a hard deadline. It makes considerably less sense for an object built from scratch with adequate time, specifically and only for the king it was meant to represent from the very beginning. If the mask was made for someone else, the timeline of Egyptian royal history points toward one specific candidate. Roughly a generation before Tutankhamun, Egypt was ruled by Akhenaten, a pharaoh who dismantled the traditional religious system, abandoned the old pantheon of gods, and restructured the entire civilization around the worship of a single solar deity. He built a new capital city in the desert, changed the visual conventions of Egyptian art, and left behind a period of religious and political upheaval, unlike anything the kingdom had experienced in over 1,000 years. Akhenaten's chief wife was Nefertiti, whose painted limestone bust, discovered in 1912, remains one of the most reproduced images in the history of art. After Akhenaten's death, the historical record surrounding Nefertiti becomes fragmented and contested. Some evidence, indirect and debated among scholars, suggests she may have ruled Egypt in her own right for a short period, under a different throne name, before Tutankhamun ascended to power as a child. If she did rule, she would have been entitled to a full royal burial, complete with funerary equipment built specifically for her, including a death mask. If she died before that equipment was ever used, and if Tutankhamun's funeral planners found themselves scrambling with weeks instead of years to prepare a royal burial, the sequence writes itself. A finished mask sitting in storage. A king who died with none. A deadline that could not be moved. For decades, this remained exactly that. A theory, compelling but unprovable, because proving it would require looking beneath the visible surface of the gold, and nobody was willing to damage the most famous archaeological object on Earth to test an idea. That changed, indirectly, in 2014, when a conservation accident forced the mask into a laboratory. During routine cleaning at the museum, a worker accidentally knocked loose the mask's braided ceremonial beard, a separate gold element attached at the chin. Rather than following proper conservation protocol, staff attempted an emergency repair using a fast-setting adhesive never intended for museum-grade artifacts, and the resulting damage sparked international outrage once photographs leaked showing a visible line of hardened glue along the chin. The incident forced Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities to bring in an outside conservation team to properly correct the repair, and before beginning that work, the lead conservator secured permission to scan the mask using X-ray fluorescence, a technology capable of mapping the chemical composition of metal across a surface. The reasoning was sound. If the face had been cut from a different mask and joined to a different headdress, the two sections should carry slightly different chemical signatures, and if the cartouche had been carved over an earlier name, the underlying metal might show detectable disturbance. After extensive scanning, the results came back clean. The gold in the face matched the gold in the headdress. The hieroglyphs showed no obvious evidence of having been carved over a previous inscription. The theory was declared settled, the mask was returned to display, and the accepted history held. But a small number of materials, scientists were never fully satisfied with that conclusion for a specific technical reason. X-ray fluorescence is excellent at detecting what metal is made of. It identifies elemental composition, purity, and obvious structural breaks. What it cannot do is read the thermal history of a piece of metal, the record left behind when gold is heated, hammered, reshaped, and worked again after its original casting. A master goldsmith modifying a mask 3,000 years ago would not have been sloppy. Filling pierced ear holes with gold drawn from the same original batch, hammering the surface smooth, polishing until no seam remained visible. That level of craftsmanship would leave nothing for a chemical scanner to detect because, chemically, nothing had changed. Only the internal structure of the metal, the way its atoms had been rearranged by heat and pressure, would carry any trace of what had actually happened. And in 2014, no instrument existed that could read that kind of trace without physically cutting into the object. Think of it this way. Every time metal is heated and reshaped, the atoms inside it are forced into new positions relative to one. Another, and once the metal cools, those positions stay locked in place, essentially permanently, unless the metal is heated again to a similarly high temperature. A chemical scanner looking at that metal afterward sees only what elements are present: gold, traces of silver, traces of copper, exactly the same reading, whether the metal was cast once and left untouched, or cast, reheated, reshaped, and cast again a dozen times. It is the equivalent of testing a document for what kind of ink was used without ever being able to read what the ink actually says. To read the deeper record, you need an instrument that can measure the physical arrangement of the atoms themselves, not merely their chemical identity, and building an instrument sensitive enough to do that on solid gold without damaging it, without even touching it, has only become possible in the last few years. That instrument exists now. Over the past several years, materials physicists have developed a technique generally referred to as quantum lattice imaging, which uses precisely tuned energy fields to interrogate the atomic structure of a metal without touching or damaging its surface. When gold is heated to the point of reshaping, whether through casting, hammering, or joining one section to another, the atoms inside it shift into new configurations that remain locked in place permanently, invisible to the naked eye, invisible to conventional X-ray methods, but readable at the quantum level by instruments sensitive enough to detect them. In late 2024, a research consortium coordinated between a European Materials Physics Institute and Egyptian Conservation Authorities was granted rare access to run a non-invasive calibration study on several key artifacts from the royal collection, the golden mask included. The stated purpose was modest, testing whether the new equipment could safely operate on fragile ancient gold. Nobody involved expected to overturn a decade-old conclusion. The scanning took place after hours inside the museum, the mask isolated under controlled lighting while the instrument passed slowly across its surface, feeding data back to a bank of monitors in real time. For the first several hours, the readings matched everything the 2014 study had already established. The gold was consistent, high purity, structurally uniform across most of the object. Then the scan reached the cartouche on the back of the mask, the small oval inscription carrying Tutankhamun's throne. Name and the readings changed. The atomic structure in that specific region showed a distinct pattern of mechanical disturbance, evidence that the gold in that exact location had been subjected to hammering at a pressure and temperature profile completely different from the surrounding metal. Something had been physically flattened in that spot before the current inscription was cut into it. The team ran the scan again. The pattern held. They recalibrated the instrument and ran it a third time. The result did not change. When they widened the scan to cover the ears, the same signature appeared. The pierced holes had not simply been left open for 3,000 years. They had been filled at some point after the mask's original creation with cylindrical plugs of gold drawn from a source close enough in composition to the surrounding metal that no chemical scanner would ever flag the difference. The plugs had been hammered flush and polished to match the surrounding surface so precisely that only the atomic disturbance pattern gave away that anything had been altered at all. The most significant reading came from the boundary where the face meets the headdress, the seam running along the hairline and temples. There, the instrument detected what the lead researcher on the project described as a thermal signature inconsistent with either section's original casting, evidence that intense, localized heat had been applied from the interior of the mask, not the visible exterior, at exactly the line where two separately made pieces would need to be joined. Heat applied from behind would leave the front surface untouched, would not crack the fragile inlaid glass around the eyes, and would leave no visible seam for any previous examination to catch, and yet the gold had recorded it anyway. The final step was the most difficult and the most consequential. Working with the atomic disturbance pattern in the cartouche, the research team attempted to computationally reconstruct the faint underlying structure of whatever inscription had originally occupied. That space before it was hammered flat and recarved. It took nearly 2 weeks of processing, cross-referencing the disturbance pattern against known royal cartouche shapes from the period. When a preliminary reconstruction finally resolved on screen, it did not match Tutankhamun's own throne name, which everyone in the room already knew by heart. It matched a hieroglyphic, pattern closely associated in the historical record with a throne name. Scholars have long debated assigning to a female ruler, active in the years immediately following Akhenaten's death, the same name that has circulated for decades in the academic literature, discussing whether Nefertiti briefly held the throne herself. It is not, researchers are careful to stress, a certain identification. Reconstructing. A hammered-out inscription from atomic disturbance data is a young technique, still being refined, and the margin for error in matching partial reconstructions to known royal names is real. But the pattern is there, sitting in the gold, exactly where the century-old theory predicted it should be. What the scan appears to describe, piece by piece, is the sequence of events researchers had speculated about for decades, but could never confirm. A king dying suddenly with no death mask prepared. A court facing an impossible 70-day deadline. A decision made by someone whose name history does not record, to take a finished mask from the burial equipment of a royal figure who had died before it was ever used and adapt it. Craftsmen filling the pierced ears with matched gold. Detaching the face from its original headdress and rejoining it from behind to hide the seam. Hammering the original name flat and carving a new one over the smooth surface until nothing remained on the outside to suggest the object had ever belonged to anyone else. The work was skilled enough to fool every examination for over a century. It was not skilled enough to fool physics. The mask still sits on display today, still one of the most visited objects in the world, still photographed by millions of visitors who assume they are looking at an object made for the boy king whose face it has represented for 100 years. At the surface, that assumption holds up perfectly because it was designed to. But at the atomic level, inside the gold itself, the disturbance pattern from an older erased inscription is still there, permanent, unrecoverable by ordinary means, waiting for exactly the kind of instrument that did not exist until now. The findings have not yet completed formal peer review, and the scientific community is treating the reconstruction with appropriate caution, given how much rests on a still developing imaging technique and how significant the implications would be if fully confirmed. That caution is reasonable. Extraordinary claims about the most famous object in Egyptology deserve rigorous scrutiny before they reshape textbooks. But the underlying question the data raises is not going away, regardless of how long formal verification takes. If the mask was originally made for someone other than Tutankhamun, how many of the other objects recovered from that tomb? The jewelry sized for a woman, the coffins with names scraped away and rewritten, were part of the same emergency reassignment, repurposed in the same desperate 70-day window. And if a finished royal burial mask was taken from someone else's funerary equipment and placed on the boy king's face, what happened to that person's own burial when the time eventually came? Her tomb, if the identification holds, has never been located. Her mummy has never been confirmed. Whatever equipment was ultimately used to bury her, assuming she was ever buried with the honors her position would have demanded, remains somewhere beneath the sand, unexcavated, unread, holding whatever atomic memory it carries of its own. There's also a quieter implication buried in all of this, one that has less to do with a single object and more to do with how much of ancient history has been reconstructed from surfaces alone. Every museum label, every textbook diagram, every documentary that has ever described this mask with total confidence was working from the best evidence available at the time, and for a century that evidence was the visible surface, the chemical signature, the trained eye of an expert standing a few feet away. None of that was wrong, exactly. It was simply incomplete, built on the assumption that if craftsmen 3,000 years ago wanted to hide something, the traces of that concealment would eventually surface under close enough scrutiny. This case suggests the opposite may sometimes be true, that certain kinds of concealment were good enough to survive not just careful observation, but every scientific method available for 100 years afterward. For now, the golden face in the glass case in Cairo keeps its secret on the surface and tells the truth only to instruments precise enough to listen to what the metal itself remembers.